So, welcome everybody to today's colloquium. I am really excited about our speaker today, who's somebody I've known in the health law area in Salt Lake for a number of years. He's Robert Harrison from the just named a month ago firm of Kimball, Stilling, and Harrison. Something you all might want to know is that this is really a new firm. They've been in existence kind of for maybe a year and a half, something like this, with the three of you. But it is really Salt Lake's first boutique health practice of this kind, which is really an exciting thing. Mr. Harrison has a master's in health administration first, then a JD from the law school at St. Louis University. His legal career, he was at Snow Christensen, then he was at Johns Hopkins, then he went to Loyola, and now he's here. So the Loyola is a master's in health law, and he is particularly knowledgeable about some of the thorniest, nastiest, most eye-frying areas but most economically critical for healthcare providers, and also, I think, really important for their patients. So without any more, I'm going to turn it over to Robert. Thank you.
Can everybody hear me? Okay, good. I was a little hoarse and raspy this morning, and it hasn't gone away yet. Eye frying. I like that. That's a new one. I hadn't heard that, but boy, is that correct. I have a few relatively prepared remarks, but I love just chatting. So if you have a question that you think just can't wait, don't hesitate to ask it, and we'll leave time for more involved questions at the end. And when we get there, for better or worse, I'm happy to talk about anything that's on your mind, whether it's something that was up here or not. I have not been to Sundance, so I can't talk about the movies. But anything about health law, you get what you pay for, but nevertheless, I'm happy to chat with you. The only thing I'd like to say about our firm, yes, it is in fact, I think the only boutique health law firm in Utah. We put it together in bits and pieces over the past few years, but the three of us are not new either to what we are doing or to doing it here. And we all have something different in common, and that is we all did something else in healthcare before choosing to go to law school. Christy was a sales and marketing manager for Pfizer, and if you met Christy, you would know that immediately. She goes down to Arizona and sells sand to people, and they ask if they could pay her a little bit more, please. I don't get it. I don't know how she does it. Bill was a pharmacist, still is a pharmacist, taught pharmacy law here, and has been very, very well known nationally. He's been president of the National Pharmacy Law Association. He was at Parsons, Bailey, and Latimer for 22 years, I think. And Bill is one of those people that I have known quite well for, well, all that time. There are not many people who do what we do outside of the institutional systems. So Intermountain hires people to do what I do. The university, of course, has folks who are paid to do what I do. But once you get out of those two large systems, which is, of course, a big chunk of the market in Utah, it's pretty hard to find folks who just do this kind of work. So we all get to know each other really well, and we have long histories. So we are new as a firm, but I don't like to say old. We are seasoned. How about that? we talked about talking with you today about regulatory compliance as a practice and what that's like. And I was sketching out some ideas, and it occurred to me that I kept sort of reminding myself the things I don't like about the practice, the things that are frustrating about it. So what am I doing with my life if I'm frustrated and don't like what I'm doing, okay? That's not really what I'm saying. But in chatting with Professor Francis, I thought, what if, rather than dig into a lot of details about these regulations, these eye-frying regulations, I'd spend a little time with those and then talk about some of the things that means for a life in this area of law. What is your career going to be like? How do you think about which directions you might want to go in a career? And how do you make some choices that are probably more important than the type of law you do, the way you practice it, the way you feel at the end of the day? Because this is, I love it, it's eye-frying. It fries the rest of you too. And you have to find a way to be at peace with that. So I want to spend a little bit of time, perhaps emphasize my comments a little bit in that direction. I have some notes here in case I forget. There are two things in a regulatory compliance practice. There are regulatory things and compliance things. So, and is everybody in law school? I understand maybe some people are not.
There are 3 undergraduates, there's a political scientist, faculty
Okay.
members.
So for those who are not in law school, and maybe for those of you who are, quick story. An associate in my firm was waiting at my door last week when I showed up, and she said, I had a call from one of the hospitals, and they wanted to know about CME requirements for physicians. And they'd been looking in the law, whatever that means, to find it. Couldn't find it. So she explained that she was able to help them. Well, I made it actually in and turned on my computer, and there was a note from the client. And she said, I've already talked to Mary about this. She explained the difference in rule laws and law laws. And I thought, that's really great. So most of what I do is sort of rule laws. There are, of course, statutes. And again, for those of you who have a sense of this, how about the Healthcare Quality Improvement Act? That's a simple example. It's a statute, it's a public law, it's codified, a regulation, and then that third one, that is where we spend 90% of our time, the sub-regulatory guidance, figuring out what the government is probably going to say about something based on some guidance that isn't law. Now, I beg you, if you're interested in this work at all, take administrative law while you're here. It's something that you've really got to have a grasp on to get the most out of sub-regulatory guidance. That's the real life-frying stuff. So again, very basically, compliance. We start with the rules. The regulations are the rules. But that's really, it's sort of like the building code in a way. It's a threshold. You wouldn't want to say, oh gosh, I've got a wonderful house. It meets building code. You want to say, I've exceeded building code. I've thought of great things that make it a great house. It has all these features that suit me and how I live and when my parents are moving in and all of those things. So much more important than the threshold. So in most cases, the rules are a critical threshold. You're out of business if you don't comply with them. But they are not the most important thing. At least I don't think they are. Code of conduct. We'll talk a little bit more about that. If you are under a corporate integrity agreement, in other words, if you've gotten into some trouble with the government and they have required you to A, pay a lot of money, and B, promise to never do things again, C, they will also require you to enter into a corporate compliance program. That's part of the corporate integrity agreement. It's based on some sentencing guidelines from long ago. We'll do a little bit more about that in a minute. But for right now, just think about it as a sort of roadmap for how you're going to run your organization. A large number of hospitals in Utah have at one time or another been under corporate integrity agreements. One of the companies that owns, and this is public record, I'm not saying anything out of school, one of the companies that owns several hospitals in Utah has had several corporate integrity agreements. They don't necessarily mean that you've done something evil. It's just that's part of the negotiation with the government. in not having to pay a stiffer penalty. So code of conduct is policies, procedures, things like that for what you're going to do, how you're going to comply with the law, how are you going to follow rules and regulations. So for example, if you're a hospital, you're going to have a long list of things. It's got to touch on all of these rules. You have to have policies for billing, you have to have policies for not turning patients away from the hospital, you have to have policies for dealing with disputes among healthcare providers. The list just really goes on forever. The 7 elements, that's the sentencing guidelines, and I'll unpack that a little bit for you ahead of time. But when the government started imposing compliance programs, they decided to base them on the federal sentencing guidelines. And the federal sentencing guidelines, if you've had criminal law, you know more about this than I do because I've forgotten most of it. But you sort of get extra points if you've done certain things. This compliance program concept is helpful when it comes to that. But from those guidelines, they came up with these 7 elements of a compliance program. If you spend any time at all in compliance, you will hear a reference to the 7 elements. And that's what this is all about. They are ubiquitous now. And then here's the one that doesn't get nearly enough attention, organizational ethics. I actually spend a lot of time when I'm working with clients on compliance matters using basic principles from organizational ethics and focusing on how those inform what you decide to do. And I'll concede a bias. There are a couple of ways of looking at this overall concept. One is to be very focused on rules, a sort of rules-based approach to compliance. I'm not a huge fan of that. The other school of thought is a values-based approach. If you like philosophy, you might start thinking Robert likes Aristotle and Alistair McIntyre. You're right, I do. And lots of other people too. But the idea is that we often trip over the rules on our way to trying to be compliant. If you say to someone, here is a set of rules, whatever you do, don't break these rules. Well, that's just sort of made you nervous, right? If you say to someone, here's our culture, here's what matters to us. Following rules is, of course, part of it. But here's the kind of organization we want to be, and you are empowered to do whatever you think is going to help us get there. So, of course, you need to follow a rule, but if you see something, there's a great thing out at the airport. If you've been out there at all, you've seen it. It says, if you see something, say something. Well, if you're just rules-based, you're looking at the rules. You're not so much looking around you. And what I like is the idea that you feel that it's your job to look around you and find everything that seems to violate a rule, but more important, find the other stuff. Find the stuff that could help you do what you do in a better way. Having been in hospital leadership long ago, but this part hasn't changed, the people at the top can do some really good things, but the people who are actually with the patient, those are the folks most likely to have great ideas about better patient care. And really, that's all we're about if you're in healthcare. If you're about anything other than better patient care, find a different line of work. Some key regulatory structures that are the sort of titles of these eye-frying rules. The False Claims Act, and I'll just maybe spend a minute and a half or so on each one of these. Don't worry about memorizing what these things are. I don't even memorize them. This is just to give you sort of a flavor. The False Claims Act is one of the oldest laws that we are using on a regular basis in healthcare. Back during the 1860s, yes, not 19, during the 1860s, the Union Army found itself not getting what it was paying for. Sometimes the False Claims Act is called the Government Mule Statute. One of the things that the Army was trying to get, but not getting, was good mules. I mean, think about it. You have to move supplies and food and bullets and all those things. They would have a contract for 1,000 mules and they'd get 762, but they'd already paid for the mules. Well, you would think that there'd be a way to go after it. There was not a good federal law in the middle of the 19th century to prosecute somebody, to go after someone who was defrauding the government when the government was acting as a purchaser. So they passed the False Claims Act, and it sort of, after the war, it sort of fell out of use. But then in 1965, along comes Medicare. And there were some scary predictions in 1965, there was actually one person who suggested that by 1980 it might cost $9 billion. Exorbitant. Well, of course, it cost more than that by 1970. So the government all of a sudden said, well, wait a minute. We have become a purchaser of health care. Not just mules, not just bullets, not just $700 toilet seats. Anybody remember those? But we're now a purchaser. We are the biggest purchaser of health care. So what do we use to go after people? The False Claims Act was retooled for this purpose. It basically says, and we'll talk about how a claim can be false in a minute, but it basically says that if you submit a false claim, you're going to pay and pay big. The potential damages are 3 times the amount of the claim, and that's the bill you sent, not the money you got. So they don't actually have to pay you. Just you submitting the bill and even not getting paid is still a violation. And then anywhere from $5,500 to $11,000 per click for each bill. Now, does anybody actually pay up to $11,000 for every single mistake? No. That's where the negotiation comes in. And you, as a lawyer, you work with the government and you say, well, all right, let's just focus on only 100, not 9,000, because they'll start out with statistics. They'll come in and say, well, we looked at 7 bills, therefore 1 million of your bills are probably false. They can do that. The courts have said that you can do that. The numbers are a little bigger, but you get the idea. So you negotiate that, but at the end of the day, you pay 3 times the amount of your bill plus a fine that's not less than $5,500 for the claims that you actually agreed to adjudicate. So that's fine, but that's about bills that you submit and nothing more. So the anti-kickback statute, there was one in 1931, I think. I believe it was called the Copeland Act. It was for contractors. It wasn't really for health care. So in 1972, when it turned out that in addition to the government paying for things they weren't getting, the government was also noticing that people had established relationships in which financial incentives were passing back and forth to increase the number of services that the government would have to pay for. So you say to Dr. Jones, well, Dr. Jones, I happen to need 17 medical directors for my 10-bed hospital, and you're in family practice down the road. I'll pay you $50,000 a year to be a medical director. And your job description is, if I need you, I'll call you. That's a flat-out inducement. It's paying somebody a kickback to refer patients to the hospital. That's oversimplified. Essentially, the law says, and this is really important because it's so broad, it applies to any person. Doesn't matter who you are. You cannot offer or pay. You cannot solicit or receive anything of value, whether in cash or in kind, in exchange for attempting to influence a referral for a good or a service that's going to be paid for by a federal dollar. Whew, I got all that out. There is a lot of work for lawyers in there because there's a lot of words in that long sentence. What's a referral? What's a person? What's a service? What's paid for? You get the idea. But essentially, it's a very, very strict law saying we don't want you doing anything that improperly influences the number of services that are ordered. So, Stark Law. This is, well, the kickback statute, remember, that's kickbacks. That's I'm paying you something just to do this referral, and it's anybody. Well, that left a gaping hole because it didn't address ownership. Physicians in the late 1970s, early 1980s were figuring out that owning clinical laboratories was a great tax shelter, perfectly legal. But here's the problem. In the early 80s, it became apparent that if my doctor owned a clinical lab and I'm a Medicare patient, I'm going to get 35% more lab tests than my friend's doctor orders who doesn't own a clinical lab. So that's where it started. Stark is from Congressman Stark, Pete Stark. He was from California. He was a banker, not a lawyer, I'm always happy to say. And the law said initially, we're going to prohibit physicians from owning clinical laboratories if they refer their patients to those laboratories. It was fairly quickly expanded to include some other things. There's now a list of designated health services, 13 or 14, depending on how you count them. And there's an argument that just about anything in healthcare is probably somewhere on that list. There are some glaring exceptions, but if you're working with hospitals, you have to assume that everything is on that list. So the second thing that was added to the Stark Law, and this is the one that I argue we should get rid of, by the way, if anyone cares, as the so-called compensation prohibitions. Remember, the first piece said you can't own it and send your patients. Well, the second piece said, echoes of the anti-kickback statute, we're going to prohibit any kinds of financial relationships between physicians and entities to which they refer patients. So that medical director agreement that I mentioned a minute ago, that violated the kickback statute. It also violates the Stark Law. The Stark Law says, in essence, a physician, great work for lawyers because physician's not just physician, it's a lot of other things. Would you think an optometrist is a physician? Podiatrist? You might not. The statute just says physician. But that sub-regulatory guidance, it includes a lot of people. So a physician may not refer a patient to an entity when the physician has a financial interest in that entity. The physician also includes members of the physician's immediate family. There's one case out there that says, yes, your grandson's wife is a member of your immediate family. So it's also pretty broad. One last distinction before we move on. The anti-kickback statute is the one we always worry about most, even though most people come to ask me about Stark. And I say, never mind Stark for a moment. Let's see if you have a kickback problem. The reason is the kickback statute is criminal. People do go to jail for violating that. Stark is just about money and exclusion authorities. HIPAA, I'll just pause there for a second because I get a lot of questions about that. Most people think of HIPAA as a privacy law. HIPAA is much more than privacy. Privacy is much more than HIPAA. If you haven't read Professor Francis's wonderful new book on the subject, you should. But HIPAA has, in addition to privacy, 4 other things. It created new causes of action for healthcare fraud. So very much something that's on our radar screen. Civil money penalties law allows the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services to impose substantial financial penalties for violating any of these rules associated primarily with billing for services, but there are more broad things there as well. Remember, again, this is the Secretary administratively imposing a penalty. It can be $50,000. So it doesn't have to go to court. You don't have to have broken a law necessarily. And then the exclusion authorities, I think some of you may have seen a little update piece that I did recently about the exclusion authorities. Essentially, it means this. In addition to getting deeply into your wallet, the Secretary can exclude you from participation in the federal programs. This is whether you're an individual or an institution. For some individuals, it's not necessarily the end of your career, but if you are an institution, if you are a hospital, if you are a long-term care facility, if you are an outpatient surgery center that does knees and hips, if you cannot treat patients who are paid for with federal dollars, you are out of business. It's just the way it is. The margins in hospitals are not great enough to cover that loss. So that was a quick romp through that. The compliance structures, those again were regulations, regulatory structures. The Office of the Inspector General at Health and Human Services has, over the past 20 years, produced compliance guidance for many different sectors of healthcare. I've put up here just the information for hospitals, but if you're in other kinds of healthcare, you'll find there's one there for you too. I think they're up to 13 now. This is mostly where I spend my time because this is where HHS comes and knocks on people's doors. The 7 elements that we mentioned are found on page 89 of the compliance program guidance for hospitals. Don't worry about any more of that. If you've written it down, go read it. It's incredibly enlightening, but this is, if you practice in this area, this will be your bread and butter. This will where you will spend so much of your time here, not in a treatise. These are the 7 elements. We talked about the code of conduct, designated compliance responsibility. Every hospital in Utah and everywhere else, as far as I know, has a compliance officer, has a compliance committee, has a designated process for handling questions. The education and training is absolutely critical. If you have not done adequate, and in fact, it has to be compliant, your training has to meet the government's definition of what training should be. Hotline, really, really important. It doesn't actually have to be a telephone line, but it typically is. And the idea is that anybody can pick up the phone and anonymously leave a message about something that doesn't seem to be right. You could use a suggestion box. You could use a drop box. There are variations that are acceptable. The idea is that you have to provide a mechanism so that people can share things with you anonymously. Even if it's not anonymous, the last thing you should ever do is admit that you know who it is, because retaliation is absolutely, no question, worse than the original sin. Response and follow-up, you have to have a mechanism to show that you've listened to those calls on the hotline and that you've actually done something about it. It may not be that it might not be valid, but you have to treat it as if it's legitimate and at least provide some feedback. Auditing and monitoring, those are ongoing processes. And then remediation, if you identify a problem and it's a one-time behavior issue, that's a human resources matter for the most part. If you identify a recurring problem that's not tied to one person, that's more of an organizational or policy issue. But you must have consistent discipline and retention policies. Back to a slide we had before, and I've highlighted the Stark Law here. I won't spend any more time on it. Just to give you an example, this ownership piece, clinical laboratory ownership, was what it was about in 1986. And I'm pretty sure that we're now 30 years beyond that. You would think that we have it figured out. But we don't. Oh, I skipped one. I'm actually missing one. Oh well, let's see if it's, here it is. This is the one I wanted to show you. September 11, 2017. A physician and a family practice clinic in South Carolina. We're doing what? Sending patients to a clinical laboratory in which they had a financial interest. We still keep doing it. And I really don't mask my frustration with clients who call me, and they do. I get this regularly. People will call me and say, I want to build a lab or a radiology center or whatever. And I know that there's this law that says you're not supposed to do that. So how do we get around it? There's that ethics piece, right? Somebody's just called you and said, hey, I know I'm not supposed to do this, but you're a lawyer. It's your job to help me figure out a way to do it. How much will it cost me? Anybody remember the wonderful Humphrey Bogart movie with the black bird? You remember that one, the Maltese Falcon? There's a scene early on, it makes no sense at all. But he picks up the phone and calls his lawyer. And he says, you know, I might have to do something that's not quite right. How much will it cost to protect my license? And he says, oh, 100? Okay, go ahead. Well, now, I don't know what the lawyer was going to do to protect his license if he violated licensing rules. But that's the idea that people have. Okay, you're the lawyer, you'll figure out a way to help me do this. I won't. Then people get indignant. They'll say, well, you're a lawyer, aren't you supposed to do that? I won't go back to that other slide because we're time-wise getting short. Rules of professional conduct are supposed to be our safety. For lawyers, and think about this. This is, if you compare this to medical education, we seem to be way, way, way ahead of the curve or maybe in overdrive. You have to take a class on the rules of professional conduct in law school. You have to take a separate exam on the rules of professional conduct, essentially, to get a license. When you want to renew your license as a lawyer, you have to show that as part of your continuing education, you've taken credits specific to professionalism and ethics. We make a huge big deal out of it. And yet, it hasn't helped us tremendously. We still have lawyers doing things, and I'm sorry to say, I serve on a couple of bar committees where we deal with these issues here in Utah. It is still not uncommon we still are not behaving as we should. My personal view is it goes back to what I said up front. You can trip over the rules trying to be ethical if you think ethics is about the rules. Or you can say, if I want to be a good person, if I want to be able to look myself in the mirror, what should my conduct be? It is a rare thing indeed for conduct that meets that second standard to violate the first one. Rare indeed. So they don't always help us. How about a lawyer as a criminal defendant? This is in the past 12 years now, this has been a real concern for lawyers who do what I do, because prosecutors have attempted to convict the lawyers who advised healthcare clients about the arrangements that the client was prosecuted for. And in fact, there was a case that made it to the 10th Circuit. The lawyers, hospital executives, on appeal, everything was okay. But the point is that don't get involved in something the government's not going to like, because you could find yourself prosecuted criminally along with your client. So, authenticity. I have a sister who is a very wise person. She got all the wisdom in the family when it was handed out. When I was a teenager, she's younger, by the way. She's 3 years younger. When I was a teenager, I was waxing philosophical one night, can you believe it, about what I was going to be when I grew up. And she listened to me for a while. And I don't know, Judith might have been 13 at the time. And she said, well, do whatever you like, but you should be yourself. I have never forgotten that. So, being me is the best thing about me as a lawyer. Now, I'm not saying that makes me a good lawyer. I'm saying it makes me a more contented lawyer. I need to feel authentic. I need to feel that what I'm doing makes sense. I always say I'm not a litigator, and then people who've known me a long time laugh at me and say, well, what are you talking about? You've tried lots of cases. It's true that I have, but it was something that I did because that was part of the job, and I never saw myself as a litigator. I never felt comfortable. I would be so happy if I never walked into another court for the rest of my life. I'm glad there are people who want to go to court. I'm really so glad, because it means I might not have to. There are people who adopt a very aggressive posture in litigation or negotiations. Lawyers. They will say that they have to do that because that's what's in the best interest of their client. It might be. I'm just saying that if I tried that, it would not work. It would just be a failure, because that's not my personality. It is not authentically me to be adversarial or to try to be tough or to bully the other side. And that works for some people. For me, it simply doesn't work. Going to court is some people are really happy in court. I'm not. You can do a lot of things for a certain amount of time. But when you do this eye-frying stuff all day, every day, it will wear on you. And just trying to get to a place where the client who's trying to do the right thing can do it safely, can provide health care, that's hard. If you also have something nagging at you and you don't know what it is, because this is my experience, I finally realized, why am I so miserable about this? And I realized that I was doing some things for some clients that I didn't want to do, that I didn't think was the right thing to do. Let me just jump back. The Stark Law. The name of the law is the Ethics in Patient Referrals Act. And that's lost on everybody. If you go to a medical meeting and you say the Stark Law, everybody thinks they know what you're talking about. If you say the Ethics in Patient Referrals Act, everybody says, oh, when was that passed? What's that? That's something new, right? No. Compensation arrangements. The first one I said, ownership, just don't do it. Well, you don't have to not do it. You can own anything you like as long as you won't refer a patient. Compensation arrangements, you might say just don't do it, but we need to do it. So what about accountable care organizations? Everybody should be roughly familiar with those. That was a great idea for trying to solve some of the healthcare problems we have. Except what? When the policy people at Health and Human Services said, here's our great idea for working on healthcare problems, the enforcement people across the hall at the Inspector General's office said, well, wait a minute, you can't do that. That violates the Stark Law. That violates the Kickback statute. So we actually had to come up with 5 separate waivers of all the fraud and abuse laws just to try accountable care organizations. So we do need to do it. We need to find innovative ways for all kinds of healthcare providers to work together. We need to be sitting down at the same table talking about referral patterns, talking about compensation, talking about value and efficiency. Well, we have to come up with a better way of creating these compensation arrangements other than the 34 exceptions we currently have to the Stark Law. Someday I'm going to talk with a real constitutional law scholar who might remember this case, because I love this and I can't remember the case. It's a First Amendment case. It doesn't really matter what it is. The point is that the court, and it was a newspaper, no, it wasn't Sullivan. Conlaw people, I know. The court said that there was not a violation of the First Amendment. But there was a concurring opinion, and I love this. And the justice said, I have to join my colleagues. This does not violate the First Amendment. But having said that, I need to say that what the paper did here was wrong. Having the right does not make it right. And that's something critically important to think about. We're very focused on what is the right? What is the right? What is the right? Well, I have a right to be free from lots of kinds of intrusions, right? But the kinds of rights that, by definition, sort of intrude on other people, think carefully about that. Having the right to do something doesn't necessarily make it right. And much of my satisfaction with what I get to do is that I help people do things that are right. At least we think they are. I mean, everybody gets an opinion on that, okay? But it's great fun to spend time with people who are trying to create new relationships, new arrangements, trying to figure out new ways to provide health care that make more sense, and to try to navigate that sub-regulatory guidance as well as the regulations and the statutes to look at, I'm involved in arguing for getting rid of some of the Stark Law compensation exceptions. That's something that I can do. Clients don't pay me to do that. I wish they would. But that's something you have to find a way to do on your own, and I love doing that. So for me, here's something from a conversation at dinner a year or two ago. I was talking to a physician friend. We were talking about bad conduct by a lawyer we both knew. And she said, well, that just shows you what going to law school will do to you. And I didn't even think about it. I just sort of fired back immediately. This sounds clever. I wish I had thought about it, but I didn't, so I get no credit for it, right? I said, law school doesn't do that to anybody. You might choose law school because you already want to behave badly, and you think that getting a law license is how you can get paid to do that. You might think that that's why a career in law is a great thing, because I just get to go out and argue with people and be a bully. So some people who graduate from law school do behave that way. But it's not because they went to law school. That has nothing to do with it. They started out that way. And then the second thing is, this is something I heard in law school. I don't know if you've heard this. It's a wonderful expression. A lawyer is not a bus. Anybody heard that one? No, okay. Go slew. The idea, of course, is that a bus is a public accommodation. If I have the fare, I'm entitled to get on the bus and ride. I'm a lawyer in private practice. I am not a public accommodation. If someone comes to me and says, please do X for me, I'm free to say no. Now, you have to have a little common sense about it, because the other thing about being in private practice is you don't get a paycheck from anybody. You can't just turn down every client because you're on your ethical high horse. But there is something about being able to say, all right, I don't like this. and I'm not going to do it. So, parting scenario, this is from last week. Phone call from a company that provides a sales force to compounding pharmacies. This is issue spotting. Boy, is it. So here's the question. How do I structure a sales force that can go out and incentivize physicians to order a special pain cream from a compounding pharmacy in Texas? The pain cream will cost, I did the math, 12 times more than a therapeutically equivalent cream that could be produced by any compounding pharmacy right here in Utah. So why were they thinking that this might be a problem? Well, they're worried about the anti-kickback statute. Are you kicking money back to the physician somehow for ordering the pain cream? They were thinking about the Stark Law because physicians are involved. Those were the things that were worrying them primarily. So as I listened to their question, that wasn't what worried me. What worried me was, wait a minute, you're asking me to help you find a way to dramatically add to the cost of healthcare so that you can get some money out of it. That's not an illegal question. It's not an improper question. They weren't doing anything that was, sort of by any regular standard, wrong, illegal, improper in terms of asking a lawyer for help. There would have been nothing wrong in general if I had said, love to work on this with you. Let's do this. I couldn't do it. Now, there are other people who will do it, and I'm not, this is so important, I am not criticizing where anybody else is. It's personal. But it's going to be personal for every one of you too. And I think if you don't take anything else away, remember that you're all different. And your comfort level with what you're doing is going to vary. I have a friend who's a tax lawyer. She does tax work for anybody, everybody, doesn't matter. She's helping them deal with the tax code. She does tax work for me. So it's fine. It's not that there's anything wrong. It's just that authenticity, that's really what I'm talking about. Find a way to be sure that you are comfortable with what you are doing as you help people through this incredible maze of laws. I love this. This is Terry Tempest Williams. Some of you have read her books, I'm sure, a Utah writer, or at least partially a Utah writer. If you are in this room, you care something about healthcare. You wouldn't be here otherwise. I don't think there's ever been a time when we had more opportunity to work hard with something that's really special. I mean, a legal education is so much more than most people think about it being. In a sense, we learn how to take things apart and put them back together in different ways, for different reasons. Boy, have we ever got to do that with healthcare. We have got to find ways to take it apart and put it back together. We have got to keep our eye on the ball. We've got to keep our eye on patients and patient care. And it's great to make a lot of money doing it if it works out that you find a way to do that. And that's wonderful. But there is so much opportunity. And every one of you, I beg you, stick with this for the rest of your life because we need you. And this is so much why I'm saying this, because the eyes of the future are really looking at us. And they're saying, well, by the time you get to the future, it's too late for you folks in the past to have fixed this. And that's an incredible responsibility. So playing by the rules is really important. Being ethical, to me, is more important. And working in a regulatory compliance practice where I can help people who want to do the right thing avoid doing the wrong thing. That is so much fun. And I think every now and then we actually do some good for people. Every now and then. So anyway, I'm going to stop babbling there. As I promised at the beginning, I will talk about anything you want to talk about. I'm not bashful. I don't have any secrets. And if I do, I'll lie about them. So thank you very much. Questions? Comments? I see a quiz look. The quiz just might be, how soon do we get out of here?
No, that's not it. I think I'm analyzing because I think regulatory compliance is super interesting, and especially in the healthcare industry. I kind of set myself out as one of the weirdos that actually likes compliance and thinks it's fun instead of eye frying.
It can be both.
That was a word.
No, I got to tell you, I love it. It can be both.
Well,
yes.
and yeah, I definitely think it can be. So I think I'm more of reflecting on this to see how I think I would fit into it. I'm really curious about your experience and how you got into the industry and kind of the steps you've taken to get there.
Sure. When I was in college, several people said, "I assume you're going to law school." And I just gave this blank stare. Law school? Have you lost your mind? Never even occurred to me. I had, Groucho Marx said he was born at the age of 5 as a member of the Marx family, having no visible means of support. He signed up. So I had no visible means of support in college. I went to work in St. Mary's Hospital in Richmond, Virginia, in the emergency department. Back then, the term orderly was used. I think that's what my job title was. I emptied bedpans. And bedpans. And more bedpans. And I put sheets on beds, and I carried people to x-ray. I did anything they would pay me to do. At the end of my sophomore year in college, I was floundering. I should not have been there. I don't know what my problem was. I was too young. I wasn't focused. But I had been part of Naval Aviation, ROTC. I thought, it'd be really cool to go out and fly jets. Part of that deal was one weekend a month we got to go to the Naval Air Station at Norfolk, Virginia for flight lessons. And I got a ride down one weekend with a guy who was in the medical corps. And he just talked and talked and talked about how much he enjoyed his job. I had remembered that. It didn't strike me at the time. But when I decided it was time for me to no longer be in college for a while, I thought maybe I'll try that. Well, the Vietnam War was in full swing, and they were not very particular about who they took. And so when I knocked on the door and said, "Hey, I'm kind of interested in this medical thing, tell me about it," they grabbed me. So I got started in that, and I was fortunate because when I went through the basic training program, the hospital corps training program, if you were either the top or it was the top 2 ranking grads in that program, could choose what you wanted to do next. And I was lucky enough to be one of those people. And so I went to an abbreviated physician assistant program that qualified you to be in the military on independent duty, which meant that you made all the mistakes and you got all the blame. And so when I got out of active duty, still having no visible means of support, I came back to the hospital and said, "Give me a job." And they said, "Well, what can you do?" And again, I did whatever they would pay me to do. It was a little more interesting this time. But I took care of machines in the intensive care unit and did cardiac testing and did blood gases, you name it, whatever they would pay me to do. When I got out of college, I had an opportunity for what I thought was a very short-term job at the Medical College of Virginia, working with curriculum development in emergency medicine. They were trying to develop a residency program. And I went down there I went to MCV to stay for, I thought, 9 months. And so 7 years later, I was still there. A lot of people were encouraging me to go to graduate school in health administration. And I went across the street, literally, to the MHA program, which was one of the top ones in the country. Back then, they were the 3 M's, Michigan, Minnesota, and MCV. And I knocked on the door and said, "Hi, I'd like to sign up for your MHA program." And this very nice woman said, "Well, you'll need to apply." And I said, "Well, it's okay, I work across the street." And she said, "Well, you'll still need to apply." Anyway, so I did hospital administration for a few years after that, and it seemed the lawyers were having more fun. So I decided to go to law school, and because of that, I looked at law schools that had health law programs. At that time, because remember, I never had any interest in law school except for that. So at that time, the top 2 programs were St. Louis and Loyola Chicago. I was fortunate enough to be accepted at both, and I went to St. Louis literally and only because it was much cheaper to live in St. Louis. The tuition was about the same. But I had an apartment across the street from law school for, I think, $400 a month, and my car stayed in the parking lot out back. Chicago was obviously a much more expensive place. I had a great experience there. and then came out here to Utah. Had not expected to, by the way. There's another thing. Don't assume your path is linear. I did what most people do in the fall of their second year. I was very methodical. I thought I could figure it out in my head, right? So what's the top 10 firms around the country that are the best places to be? Where are they doing all the great stuff? And that was my list of places I was going to apply to. I had done my hospital administration work, or at least some of it here in Utah. And so when I had my list, I called a man named David Slagle, who was at that point chairman of the board at Snow Christensen and Martineau. And I was coming out for the weekend to ski. Had no thought of coming back to Utah to practice. And I called David and said, hey, can we have lunch? I want you to look at my short list of firms I want to apply for. And he didn't even ask me. It was national firms. It was the ones you would think of if you're in healthcare law. He didn't even ask me what's on the list. He said, well, why in the hell don't you want to come to work for us? And I said, David, you don't do what I want to do. They had a huge medical malpractice defense group, and that's how I had gotten to know him. But no regulatory work. And he said, well, we ought to. So what do? I was really lucky. I got offers from some large firms in Chicago and DC. I would have worked in the basement on somebody else's project for 2 or 3 years before really getting out to see a client. That's not that I wouldn't have been capable. That's just the reality in a really big law firm. And, at this point, remember, I'd been out for a long time before law school. And I had there was a woman at, it was then Armstrong Teasdale in St. Louis, which is a great regional firm with a huge health law practice. They've since become 2 or 3 other things. She said, Robert, you don't want to do this. Authenticity, remember? So you can, yes, if you really want to come to work for us, you can start tomorrow, but you won't like it. And she was right. So my worry about coming to Utah where I would have no subject matter mentor, I thought about that and I said, well, what do I care? The regulations in healthcare change every week anyway. There's no such thing as an expert. It's just, do you know where to look it up, right? And I could have a mentor for being a great lawyer by coming here, and I did. His name was Hal Christensen. He taught me a great deal about the law in general and being a better person. Anyway, so that's 35 years in a nutshell.
Thank you.
No, thank you. I appreciate the question.
I can't resist saying something about Maura because she's got a lot of experience in sports and very interesting, just enormously interesting comparative questions, I would guess, between the kinds of pressures that an athletic department has.
Yeah, I thought it was super interesting that how you look at regulations as like a threshold and a baseline.
Mm-hmm.
Coming from athletics, we look at regulations as kind of a maximum, and try to get our coaches and our teams to be able to push the boundaries as much as possible. We see them more as like suppression of what we want to do, instead of a minimum that we'd like to excel to have a greater experience. We think of the greater experience as being able to push those and fudge the lines as much as possible.
Yeah. And there are a lot of people in healthcare, and this depends a great deal on what regulation you're talking about. But there are a lot of people in healthcare who would say you're exactly right. And some of them were in the Congress when they passed the Affordable Care Act, particularly with respect, many examples, but accountable care organizations, that's a great example. The CMS...
Can you translate accountable care
organizations? Let me, I was just getting ready to say I was going to translate CMS. So, again, I'm sorry, I know you have various backgrounds. The Department of Health and Human Services has all kinds of different divisions and offices. Very, very broad. Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services are really the money people for paying health care. Within, and I know it's 4 letters and we only say 3, nobody knows why, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services is CMS, not 2 M's. Within CMS, there are the policy people, and then there are the enforcement people. And that is the most schizophrenic group. And so if you hear somebody at CMS say it, you have to be really clear who it was that said it and in what context. So when the one of the ideas of the Affordable Care Act was that we would provide better quality, better access, and lower cost if we could structure organizations with shared accountability for sort of a continuum of a patient's problems. Lots of larger systems and some smaller ones struggle to do this. And it's putting together relationships between hospitals, physicians, outpatient centers. You can structure them in a variety of ways. But basically the idea is, here's a chunk of money. And you as a group are accountable to provide care to these people for this chunk of money. So that meant, of course, that if the hospital formed the Accountable Care Organization, the ACO, and the hospital got the chunk of money, well, it had to give some to the physician. Stark. Immediately. We had to, so people were saying, wait a minute, we've got this great idea, but these regulations they're keeping us from pushing the boundaries. And when I have, and this is, you have to decide, you want fun or money, because sometimes you have to make a choice. I spend a lot of my time doing things for fun. That's not a complaint, I don't regret it. But I go to a lot of policy meetings, and I've made ways to be involved in some committees in Washington. And there really are people who are trying to do some good things, but these regulations get in the way, which is why I think some of them we just have to go. Aristotle famously said, if you make a bad law, then you ought to go back and change it. Well, we ought to when it comes to some of these things. So it's not as different as you might think. What I'm really talking about is that, not that the rule itself is sort of the, I'm really saying that following the rules should not be all you do when you're structuring a healthcare organization. That you should look for something better than that. And your quest for something better than that is the best way to avoid violating the rules. Now, when it comes to something as really specific as billing codes, grandma got run over by a reindeer and broke her left leg on the right side of the road after being hit by a Chevrolet. You got to get that right. I mean, it's rules. There's no way around it. You've got to do that right. But there's so much more going on. And the secret is for people who work in your institutions. And I got to tell you, if you work in a hospital for very long, you will take your hat off to most of the people who work there. They do not get paid enough. Their working conditions are very difficult. Most of the people they talk to in the course of a day, the patients are unhappy about something and tend to take it out on them. And then their bosses are constantly looking at them for why can't you work more for less? And then there's signs all over everywhere that says, if you dare violate those rules, you're toast, you're out of here. So it's a stressful kind of environment. So what I'm so committed to is creating cultures that are not just compliant, but that empower people to look for better ways to do things. And there's a huge role for lawyers in this, not just healthcare lawyers, for human resources lawyers, for people who are involved in financial structures. There's so much that you can do as a lawyer that is really meaningful. And finding what fits for you. Meaningful for you might be being a prosecutor. It might be being a tax lawyer. And that's wonderful. I'm just saying that in my little tiny piece of the world, that thinking that at the end of the day, whatever else happened, that I sort of put my effort into making something a little better for patients. That's what I get off on. What else? Yes, sir.
My question was regarding your practice right now. What would you say is the breakdown of compliance and regulatory versus med mal?
Oh, that's easy. We don't do any med mal.
No med mal?
None. Just a quick comment on that. Medical malpractice it's important. Medical malpractice law is important in healthcare. It's not a substantively, why was that so hard? It's not a substantively discrete area of healthcare law. So the legal doctrines in medical malpractice are basic tort doctrines, right? What's my duty? What's the standard of care? Did I violate it? It's not a separate body of law that's unique to healthcare. And so regulatory people generally don't do medical mal. It's a So if I'm talking to somebody who has no clue what healthcare law is, but they know law generally, I will say, just think of me as a regulatory lawyer. And they say, oh, I know what that is. So if you're talking to somebody who doesn't understand medical malpractice, I would say think of it as insurance defense work if you're on the defense side, or as personal injury plaintiff's work if you're on the plaintiff's side. But you're not really looking, for the most part, at these kinds of healthcare regulations. So it's a specialty. Yes, sir.
I was going to ask how when the election cycle comes and the HHS, the personnel gets the shakeup, how much does that affect what you do? And are your clients knowledgeable enough to like call you and say, hey, this happened, should we be worried?
Some and occasionally. This recent election, no one knew what to expect. How was that? Is that okay? Really, no one knew what to expect. One of the things that happened very early on, I think it was January 30th, President Trump said, first of all, to HHS, well, to all of the agencies, but again, I live in this narrow world, said to HHS and all the others, if you're going to have a new regulation, you're going to have to get rid of 2 existing regulations. That was an executive order. And then within 2 or 3 days of that, Reince Priebus, who was his chief of staff at that time, issued a memorandum to everyone in the agencies that says, we're going to just put off implementing new final rules for a while. And then not just the president, but again, remember, it was a larger transformation. Something else started happening in the Congress. The use of the Congressional Review Authority to set aside regulations that Congress didn't like. It had happened one time since the Congressional Review Authority law was passed, which, I don't know, was it 80s? Somewhere in there. One time. In the first 4 months of the Trump administration, it happened 17 times. Only one of those affected Health and Human Services, and it was on a technical matter, so it did not actually affect any of these regulatory structures. I will say that 2017 has seen an unusually active regulatory calendar. Lots of fairly new things happening in 2017 across healthcare regulation. Significant things at the FDA, revisions to the Exclusion Authorities, lots of fairly significant changes on a regulatory level. And so whatever people might have expected, there's actually been a fairly substantial level of regulatory activity there was in 2017. I don't expect that's going to slow down. Clients worry with every new administration. They worry who the secretary is going to be. In this case, there was, this is going to be Dr. Price, and he's a physician, and he's really great about medicine, and so he'll be a good person in that job. He was, however, not so careful as he might have been about his airplane tickets, and so, of course, he's no longer the secretary. There's a lot of tension right now because of the choice for his replacement confirmed last week. Because of his industry background. I think those things are not unique to any particular electoral cycle. There's always fear. Clients will call you and they will say, should I worry about something changing? And the answer, I'm sorry, is always, don't know, we'll keep an eye on it for you. So sometimes they pay you to keep an eye on it, but usually they'll say, call me if you hear anything. Yes?
Keeping in mind the proactive nature of your work and kind of your values-based approach, how involved do you feel like you get to be in crafting solutions that really educate the providers, the end users, on how to comply with things?
Very.
That's great.
That's a very big chunk of what I do. Preventive medicine is always cheaper than trauma surgery and far less painful. That is a concept that has started to resonate with more and more clients. And there's no place where you can just go and say, okay, tomorrow this is what I'm going to do. It really does have to evolve. But my sort of academic bent. Really, it's a good fit there because I enjoy it. This kind of stuff, if you don't enjoy it, you can't make it interesting. There's nothing you can do to make this stuff interesting. You have got to love it. So you've got to have some enthusiasm for it. And when you can help providers see that there are ways to do this that comply with what they have to comply with, but that also create value for their patients and for their practice. So for example, if you've got, easy example, I worked with a physician who came to see me because he had a demand for repayment, some overpayments. There is one of the provisions that's associated with those 5 ugly laws is a thing called a reverse false claim. Remember, the false claim is you submitted a claim to the government for something that either wasn't provided as billed, was substandard. There's a long list of reasons why it might be a false claim. So if you are paid and then you find out later that you shouldn't have been paid, you find it out, not the government. You have 60 days from that point to return the money. And if you keep it, it's referred to as a reverse false claim. Now, I don't know who came up with that, but basically it means rather than bill you for something that I didn't do, I'm keeping money for something I didn't do or didn't do properly. So that's what had happened to this physician. The government had come knocking on his door and said, you're in trouble. You knew 4 months ago that you had this money and you didn't pay it back. One of the big legal arguments there is what constitutes knowledge. When did I know? What did I know? And when did I know it? So legally, the argument there, the issue was, how do we talk to the government and show them that I didn't actually know? In other words, I couldn't reduce it to a specific dollar figure as far back as you think I could. And P.S., I've already paid you back. Because that's, when people come to me that question, the very first thing I say is, get out your checkbook, write the check, we're going to pay them back today. No matter what else we do, we're going to pay them back. So the next thing we did was, I said, all right, let's find out why this happened. He had no auditing and monitoring. The person doing his billing wasn't properly trained. And we spent some time together, and I showed him how changing his policies, changing the way people were handling his billing, was not only going to keep him out of trouble, but was going to save him a substantial amount of time and money. And that's money he could have, or time he could have spent with patients, or maybe with his children. But in any event, that was an opportunity to say, this is what you asked me, but let's broaden it a little bit. And sometimes people say, well, I can't afford that. What's it going to cost me? And my solution to that, if I think that it will work, is to say, well, how about a flat rate? You don't have to pay my regulatory lawyer hourly rate. How about we do something different so that you and I can have a number of conversations and you're not constantly doing this because you're... If you're in private practice, you live on your billable hours. But sometimes you can live on a flat rate. And if you don't want to drive a Maserati, you can do pretty well with that. Great. Yes, ma'am.
Do you know how the case came out, the one about the prosecutors with the health lawyers?
I'm sorry, the case about...
The case that just went up to the 10th Circuit, I think?
Oh, it wasn't just. It was several years ago.
Oh.
Their convictions were overturned.
Oh.
So they didn't have to wear the orange. Well, they did actually for a little while. But bad enough that they had to wait that long, right? That's pretty scary. And the government's not backed off. Another place that they've not backed off of is the question of whether you are... it was the government's position until recently, for a long time, that in order to negotiate anything in a fraud and abuse investigation, you as the lawyer had, or your client, had to waive attorney-client privilege. That the government wouldn't talk to you unless you waived attorney-client privilege and got everything from your lawyer. There's been some, during the Obama administration, the Justice Department backed off of that. We haven't seen it change recently. I don't think we will. But that was extremely difficult for lawyers and for clients. One of the other things about privilege, if you are engaged in assisting a client with violating one of these rules, then you no longer have a privilege. So that's another thing to remind your client of, if they want you to walk over in the shady areas. Yes, sir.
Given all the recent activity, as you're saying, the 17 times versus 1 or 2 in the previous extended period of time, is that an indication of just where the area of law needs to be focusing or moving towards, or where the government needs to address stuff? 'Cause, I mean, I know.
Probably not. These were 17 very different regulations. My sense is it was more about a momentum in the folks who were elected to office at that time, a desire to do something about a perception that we have far too many regulations. I don't disagree with that, by the way. But I think that's what seemed to be unique, is that there were a group of people in Congress who were very energized about reducing regulations. It's an interesting development. Too soon to know in the regulatory world, these things can happen quickly, but the effects, you don't know what they are for years. But again, and I really did not read the other ones, but for Health and Human Services, it was a technical correction to something that had no policy impact. So it really didn't matter. And it's stopped now, by the way.
Okay.
So.
Do you do anything with like compliance for record retrieval and audits, like when your clients are getting audited for their Medicare and Medicaid stuff after the fact, or do you kind of just work on the front end creating policies so that in the event they are audited, they pass the audit?
Do a lot of after the fact.
Okay.
You have to do a certain amount of after the fact to make enough money to
Do the before.
do the before the fact at a lower rate. Yeah, quite a lot of that. It varies. I'm going to try to sort of ballpark a percentage here. Depending on the month, I would say probably about 40 to 50% of my work, maybe usually closer to 40, is defense work now. It used to be much more than that because compliance is just slowly catching on. I mean, it's going great guns, but in a lot of places, people are. They see a price tag associated with it, and there is. You can't do it for nothing. So I'm evolving because what you'll find in private practice is you can buy a billboard, it's worthless. It's not going to do anything for you. What you need is people that you've done work for talking to their colleagues and say, you know what? You ought to talk to that Harrison guy. He helped me, maybe he can help you. Most of the new business that I get comes from referrals from clients. Some from other lawyers. What else? Anything?
Well, perhaps it's time to talk to Harrison. I mean, to thank you and break and talk more informally.
Sure, absolutely.